Hi, Heather. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'm just unmuting myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you for being here on behalf of all of us here at SEGAP and Omnivora and Nicolás Trejo, the translator, and everyone. And yeah, whenever again.
Great. Well, thank you.
You can start. I'm sorry, we already introduced you here in Spanish, so we already.
Oh, okay. The introduction is done. I should just start?
Yeah, sorry. I forgot to say.
Okay, that's fine. I'm ready whenever you guys are. So I'll just begin.
Yes.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm thrilled about the translation and the event. So I'm just going to speak a bit about the book and what it's meant to me, and then we'll have a discussion. So very happy to be here. Um, Feeling Backward came out in 2007, and I had started writing it during my PhD program, and really been thinking about it for almost 10 years before it came out. So I've been with this book for about 30 years. It was the first book that I wrote, and it's very personal to me. I often compare it to a first novel or a sort of coming of age story because there's a lot of me in this book. Again, I'm very grateful to you for the translation and for the opportunity to speak with you about this book today. When I began to study queer literature and culture in my PhD program, I was surprised by the gap between what I knew of queer life and academic discussions of it. People in the community, sorry, my dog is here. Shh, shh, shh. No, go lay down. People in the community, whether artists or activists, political figures, friends, elders, lovers, we were all willing and to talk about queer life in a way that acknowledged its strangeness, its difficulty, and its dark humor. When I started reading academic criticism, I read a lot of positive accounts of gay life and politics. I was inspired. Yes, we are everywhere, but it also left me feeling confused and a bit unsettled. The field of lesbian and gay studies, but also the emerging field of queer theory, uh, was intent on transforming society and making it life better for gay and lesbian people. I also wanted that and want that. But and was working on that. But as a critic, as someone just starting to write about and think deeply about gay and lesbian culture and representation, it seemed impossible not to engage with the glamour and suffering that were central to my own experience as a gay person, albeit a young one, as well as with my uh, understanding of the history of queer literature um, and representation and experience, not my own. Feeling Backwards started off as a dissertation at the University of Virginia. It was originally called Failure as a Way of Life. That was its first title. I did my PhD on modernist literature, and it shows in the book. The chapters address the work of modernist authors like the American novelist Willa Cather and the English essayist Walter Pater. These may not be the most familiar figures, but it's that was kind of how the work came came to be through a reading of those books. But it really was developed through my several year engagement with this 1928 book by Radcliffe Hall, The Well of Loneliness. And this was a really influential book. I'd never read it before I went to do my PhD, but it was often called the most famous lesbian book of all time. But as critics tried to read the book in a positive light, to emphasize how Radcliffe Hall had imagined a better future for gay and lesbian people, I had to point out this book was called The Well of Loneliness. A big melodrama, it features a very earnest main character, Stephen Gordon, a masculine woman who loves women but just wishes that she could be normal. I thought to myself, okay, this is an important piece of gay history, even perhaps an important piece, part of the path to liberation, but no one has been able to talk about what it is actually about, which it is really the kind of difficulty of being a gay subject. This is a very depressing book, and no one seemed to be able to just look at that head on. In fact, it is so depressing that this book, The Well of Loneliness, remains uncomfortable to read to this day, which is why I argued that most critics don't really read it. Rather, they read around it or read over the book's most unavoidable theme, that being gay is difficult. Based on my own reading of The Well of Loneliness, I ended up making two main arguments in Feeling Backward. First, and this point is so obvious that it almost doesn't seem like an argument, but it is. I made the argument that 20th century queer life was difficult. I felt that I needed to make this point, that it's difficult, but also that we need to pay attention to the evidence of that difficulty, even when it is uncomfortable to do so. That's argument one. Argument two, I argued that the reason that these books and representations were so hard to read was that the difficulties that they described were still relevant in the present. Of course, things in 2007, when I was writing a PhD in queer literature at a major American university, were obviously different from what they were in 1928 when Radcliffe Hall's book was judged as obscene in a court trial, even though there's no sex in it. Things were obviously different in 2007, and they're different again in 2025. But um, I but it wasn't because I argued, but it wasn't because The Well of Loneliness was so outdated that modern readers couldn't be bothered with it anymore. Instead, I argued it was because the feelings that Radcliffe Hall describes in The Well of Loneliness are still too familiar, too live, so that modern readers hate the book, and that's the reason that modern readers hate the book so much. It is not because, that is to say, that these books were too far from us, but rather that they were too close to us, that they made modern readers cringe. I think that the argument of the book can be mistaken for a conservative one. If nothing ever changes in LGBT life, why even make the effort to change the world? But even though the book engages with some authors who were ambivalent about gay life or gay politics and were quietist or even just conservative in their politics, this was not my argument. Instead, I wanted to argue against the complacency of progressive linear history. If we believe that things are getting better and better, that it always gets better, then it is hard to find the motivation to fight. Better to just sit back and ride the rising tide of history. At the time that I wrote Feeling Backward, I was very troubled by the idea that people thought we were living in a moment that we could call post-gay, when the facts of homophobia and gender violence were just not an issue anymore. I think it is clear to many more people now, today, in the world we're in, how absurd such a claim is. History does not move in a straight line, and the movement toward social inclusion, acceptance, and tolerance is, as these words suggest, a falsehood to begin with. If what we are aiming for is true equality and freedom, it should be clear that tolerance is not enough. This is the key political argument of the book, and I got there through a steady attempt to uncover bad feelings about being gay, both in the past and the present. While it might be depressing to acknowledge these feelings, they are a very reliable indicator, I suggest, of the social conditions of queer life. Why do we feel bad about being gay? Because the world would prefer that we were not this way. Inconvenient as it is, we have to hold on to the emotional evidence that makes clear how much the world still has to change. Along with this rather grand argument about how to change the world, there is a smaller argument, a more personal argument that the book has had, that I think that has had some uptake in the world. And this is an argument that I'm frankly kind of proud of and was unexpected to me. Since publishing Feeling Backward, I've heard from people from around the world and in many different social circumstances telling me that they found the book comforting, um, in that it acknowledges the ongoing difficulty of gender and sexual minorities. People have talked to me and written to me to express gratitude about the permission that they felt from the book. They described feeling pressure in the world to come out and to feel good about coming out when they could not or didn't want to come out, or that didn't solve their problems. They had found very little support for that experience. I'm proud of the way that the book allows people to cultivate different relations to their queerness without judgment. If we are in the business of combating social stigma, I think we are, then I think we need to fight stigma, not punish the people who are feeling the effects of stigma most strongly. This suggests, I think, this attitude of punishing people for not feeling good about gayness, I think, is suggests that, that politics is just a matter of achieving the right mental attitude about one's conditions in life. As I wrote in the end of the book, th this book was addressed to a group that I called the backward. For people who don't always feel proud or excited about the bright new day that is dawning. I think that most people struggle and that experiences of hardship, whether economic, social, or personal, make life more difficult. That might seem obvious, but I firmly believe that to address the root causes of suffering, whether it is poverty, homophobia, racism, or gender violence, in order to fight the root causes of suffering, we have to acknowledge that suffering. this necessity draws us into a kind of paradox because we don't want to acknowledge or accept the reality of structural conditions of inequality. We want to keep pushing back against such conditions. But when we engage in magical thinking and instead of changing those conditions, we wish them away, then we end up shifting the blame for inequality to those who are most affected by it. We have to fight injustice, but we also have to deal with its effects. And it is in the service of that acknowledgement and acceptance that I wrote Feeling Backward. So that's just my contemporary reflections on the book and these arguments that, almost 20 years later still feel quite relevant to me, quite live. But I really would love to hear from you all and to just open the discussion and take any questions or comments that you have. Thank you.
And so I am going to translate all the questions and comments for you, and tendría al final dijo que estas fueron sus presentaciones estaban fuera, también tiene que estar.
Pero lo primero que preguntar es sobre la economía, la sensación de que existió alguna vez un tiempo que un régimen pero no más fácil.
Ya se la imaginó, se imaginar que podía decidir.
No, como está viviendo, como leer incluso, o sea, específicamente esa idea de que existió alguna vez un tiempo post-gay, también parece volver para atrás.
So, first question or comment or giving your thoughts about it is, so we're living in a Trump age and here late age, and what are your thoughts about this post-gate moment? If you,
Como el contraste entre la idea de lo post-gay y verdaderamente volver para atrás en términos de derechos.
Okay, so going backwards or moving backwards in terms of rights, and this post-gay idea. It's a bit general, but
No. I mean, I think the idea that I was writing, it was a very different moment in the 2000s, and I'm sure that was affected also by being able to study queer literature, which, I had never, I mean, I became a professor of queer studies. That seemed unimaginable to me from how I grew up and everything. So, there was evidence around that things were just improving. And, I think many people were very excited about that. But there's no way to kind of hold on to that idea. I mean, to speak to Trump and the specific conditions of the US, I mean, there is a real break, I would say now, that's much more clear and wasn't as clear at the moment between the status of, say, wealthy gay men, many of whom are in the Trump administration, um, and people who are economically disadvantaged, people who are racial minorities, people who are trans, especially. And there's a kind of divergence there, a split between, and in fact, during Trump's campaign, I think Vance said something like, well, normal gay guys are okay. It's literally that ability to say like, oh, there is a kind of piece of gay life that can just live stigma-free and be fine. But I think that it's foolish to think that, even white gay men in the present are insulated from the attack on everyone who's not, Christian, white, heterosexual, and really male, actually. So, the idea that there is a kind of rising tide of history, that everything will just, invariably get better, I think everyone knows that that's not true. It's, we're yet to see all the consequences of that play out. But I think the question of the sort of upward progress of history, everybody knows that everyone can see for themselves that that's not the case. Um, so, I sort of hope that feeling backward can was an important corrective to that kind of optimism back in a different moment, but also that it will be helpful in a moment of uh, increased intolerance, violence, and inequality. I hope that it can work in both of those contexts.
Bueno, sí, obviamente los vi fueron momentos muy distintos, y por ella fue muy importante el momento de la posibilidad de poder estudiar y poder sentir en comparación con lo que había imaginado de joven, poder trabajar de hecho como profesora, que en ese momento había una cierta evidencia de mejoría y eso generó mucho entusiasmo con mucha gente, pero que no hay modo de agarrarse esa idea, que hay un libro real, que está muy claro hoy, que por ahí no estaba tanto en el momento, habla de la campaña. Y esta idea de que los hombres gays ricos podían un poco zafar, que Vance dijo, lo gays normales, bueno, no tengo problema, pero que me parece que tanto creer que los hombres, que incluso los hombres gays blancos van a estar a salvo del ataque a todo lo que no sea cristiano, hetero, blanco y en definitiva hombre, bueno, claro que no. Y esta idea de como la producción de la marea ascendente o el progreso inevitable, que todos sabemos que no es cierto, están cobrarse las consecuencias, pero ya se ve que no es el caso y que creo que el libro en ese momento distinto fue un correctivo importante, pero que me parece que puede ser útil en momentos de mayor intolerancia y violencia. Sí.
Es que hay que.
Ah, sí,
Le voy a. Okay, hi. Thank you very much. I work in anthropology of ages. I work with children and adolescents. Some of them are queer children and adolescents. And when I talk to them, of course, it's difficult to say, don't worry, it gets better.
Yeah.
It's not happening. But it is also difficult not to say that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that your book brings us some key elements to create an intergenerational dialogue between inside queer communities. I'm still thinking on that, and I wanted to ask you what you think about that dialogue that we need to have.
Yes, thank you. I really love that question. And as I was kind of suggesting in my comments, I mean, this is a very academic book about these, novels that, I'm an English professor, but I also think of the book as a kind of self-help book, if you will, right? A kind of psychological book, and I do think it has been helpful to many people. That's what I've heard from people, and I wrote it honestly with that in mind. That I thought the pressure to kind of feel out, come out, feel proud, was backfiring and was making life too difficult for people, right? Where they were ashamed to be gay, but also ashamed to be ashamed. Right? It doesn't make sense, I think, as a as a kind of general framework, right? Why punish people for the feelings that the world causes them? So that's very important. But I think the question, and I like that you're putting it in terms of children's development, right? Because it's so important to, I mean, the It Gets Better campaign was extremely important in terms of giving people a sense of hope, and letting them know that there were different ways of life out there. And, at this point, I think I wrote Feeling Backward. I was in my 20s. Um, I had a much more difficult life, right? And I grew up in Kentucky, in a kind of a poor background with a lot of homophobia. I felt very much like the kind of outsider that I was talking about. Now, I'm a professor, I live in Philadelphia, I have a dog, as you saw, um, and kids, and I have a nice life, and I am now more that kind of positive role model, if you will, right? I'm like the evidence that life gets better, even to myself, right? If I could have seen myself when I was 16, sitting here at, 55, having this like, really nice gay life, I would have been like so amazed, right? So I don't want to discount the idea that positive role models are important. It's absolutely true, right? But I also think at the time that the It Gets Better campaign, I was giving a lot of talks on that. As you can imagine, people wanted to know what I thought about that campaign and its usefulness. And I made the argument that positive role models are important, but that we also need a range of different models of what life looks like, right? Because I mean, the sort of transformations that my life has gone through are almost unbelievable even to me, right? And I say, oh, it would have been nice if when I was 16 and depressed and lonely, if I'd been like, oh, this is great, I'm going to live this way. But I also think that, at that age, I might have been like, that's not true. That can't be. There's no way to get there from here, right? So I actually think that it's a combination. I'm not saying we should never have positive role models or we should never have hope for the future. And kids need that, absolutely. They need that. But I also think they need more realistic accounts of what life is like, that it's difficult, it's uneven, and that's okay, right? It's like you don't have to get it perfect, right? And like I said in my talk, most people struggle in one way or another, and that's okay. Like, I think that's an important part of development too, is to understand that, life is complicated and we still face um, dramatic conditions. And, I mean, part of what was so, you're hearing me talk a lot about social class, but that was a very important piece of the It Gets Better campaign to me, right? Like you're going to be lifted out of your rural town and, in some cases, poverty. And now you're going to be living in the city and having this fabulous gay life and going skiing on the weekends and, you know, and that's not a reality for the vast majority of people. Most people aren't rich. And many gay and trans people can't move to the city. They have to live where they grow up and they have to deal with their community. And I think that this kind of bright and shiny view of what it can be like that, is well represented on TV and in the movies, right? We can see lots of people living in, cities and going to gay bars and, you know, living this high life. But that's not the reality for most people in the world. So I think that it's helpful to have some representation of that hope, but unrealistic hope can be depressing in itself.
Bueno, sí, obviamente es un libro muy académico de novela, pero en inglés, especialmente piensa que... brevemente.
Le pregunté qué hacemos con los diálogos, qué le decimos a los pibes, a los niños, a los adolescentes que son gays y lesbianas y trans y tienen muchísimo sufrimiento y no les decimos, todo va a estar bien cuando crezcan, pero tampoco podemos,
Entonces, bueno, el libro de que parto también un poco de ayuda, ya que vieron, lo lógico, que sí cree que esto utiliza a mucha gente, que esto fue lo feedback que tuve, que eso lo tuve en mente al escribirlo. Que la presión por el orgullo y por salir del closet generaba que la vida fuera más difícil, que hubiera vergüenza por ser gay, pero también por sentir vergüenza por ser gay, y que le parece que no hay que castigar a las personas por los sentimientos que son importantes, ¿no? Entonces, bonita esta campaña de todo va a mejorar. Bueno, eso que te parece que es importante, ¿no? Esta campaña da esperanza, mostrar que hemos puntos de vivir, que se escribió el libro de los 20, cuando tenía los 20, como tenía 20, y que la vida entonces era muy distinta para ella, mucho más difícil, que vive en Kentucky en contexto de pobreza, ¿no? Homofobia, que se sentía como nosotros outsiders de que se hablaba, y que ahora, profesora, que vive en Filadelfia, que tiene un perro como escuchamos, que tiene chicos, que tiene una vida linda, esa misma es como ese modelo positivo. Incluso puede ser evidencia que las cosas fueran incluso para sí misma, es decir, pues, me hubiera podido dar a los de chica, bueno, eso. Entonces me parece que es importante no descartar la idea de la importancia de los modelos, es verdad, pero que ¿qué es el momento de la campaña? Que muchas charlas, gente le preguntaba qué opinaba, y lo que decía era, es importante los modelos, pero también mostrar un rango de modelos diferentes sobre la vida, que las transformaciones de su vida fueron casi increíbles hasta para sí misma, y que si hubiera sido bueno, a los 16 le hubieran dicho, cuando estaba deprimida, que se sentía sola, qué sé yo, le hubieran dicho que cosas iban a mejorar, pero que no lo hubiera creído, que hubiera parecido que no había manera de llegar a eso. Entonces, le parece que ambas cosas son necesarias. Tiene que haber modelos, pero que también tiene que haber un rango de modelos más realistas, que muestren las dificultades, las desigualdades, que está bien, que no te tiene que salir perfecto, que a casi todo el mundo le cuesta, que la vida es compleja, que hay condiciones muy dramáticas, y enfatiza el factor de la clase social, que fue una parte muy importante de la campaña, porque parecía como que te iban a sacar de tu contexto, ibas a vivir en la ciudad, ir a bares gay, ir a esquiar, y que eso no es una realidad para la mayor parte de las personas. La mayor parte de las personas no son ricas, tienen que vivir en el lugar donde crecieron. Entonces, y que ese modelo del gay exitoso está ya muy bien representado en la televisión, en las películas y demás, que es la realidad para la mayor parte de las personas, y que entonces enfatiza la utilidad de no quedarse solo con esos modelos no realistas.
Sí, sí. Hi, Heather. Thanks for your talk. And I wanted to share with you that we've been discussing your book for the past 5 or 6 hours with
Okay.
and it's been amazing. Great readings of your books by Argentinian academics that are using your book to rethink their own research. So it's been amazing. I think you would be very proud.
Thank you so much.
And we talked a lot about how to read your book, a book that was written 20 years ago today, with such a different political landscape. And I think what's interesting about your book, or at least in my reading of your book, is that it's not about choosing between pride or shame or progressive history versus regressive history. It's about showing the problems that arise when all there is to think about when you're talking about politics or identity is pride or just progress, you know, what gets left behind in these sort of narratives. And I think it's useful also to think about the sort of narrative that we have today, which is regressive narrative. Like, okay, we're in a very apocalyptic time, everything is horrible, and we get, you know, every day there's an attack against LGBT community, feminism, at least in Argentina. I'm guessing that the US is the same. But I think there's something to say about regressive history as well. The problems around this idea that it's always getting worse and the past was better. The past was not always better, not for everyone. There's also a lot of gray areas to think about this idealized past that we have, for instance, I don't know, in the early 2010 when we had gay marriage, gender identity law, and everything. But it wasn't bright and shiny for everyone. So I think it's I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it's interesting to think how we can use your critique, which is not about choosing, you know, this or that, shame or pride, but to show the problems, the gray areas, or what gets left behind. Also to think about this regressive movement that we're experiencing and the narrative around it.
Thank you so much, well, for the 5 hours of discussion, but also but also for your comment, because I really appreciate that. And you know, I think it helps to avoid a misreading of the book, right? Which would say like, you know, that what I was arguing was not it gets better, but it gets worse. That is not at all the point, right? It's not about, and I love the way you said it, it's not about choosing between pride and shame or between progressive and regressive history. It's about what happens when we sort of narrow the scope of what's possible and are not able to address the full range of experience and to pay attention really to people's experience. I mean, that is it's a kind of humanist point, but that people's feelings and their experience is helps us to understand the social situation, right? So rather than thinking of people's feelings as kind of irrelevant or a small part of politics, right, that we actually use feelings and pay attention to feelings as a kind of important indicator for where politics should happen. And, you know, I do believe that, but um, it does require not thinking in these kind of black and white either or terms, right? It's either good or bad, right? And kind of cultivating practices of careful attention to what people are actually experiencing. And I mean, I believe in that in general. You know, I do study literature, and you know, that is kind of why I teach literature, right? Because I think literature is actually a very good place to train students, teach students how to pay attention to the fine points of human experience. And I think, you know, that's something that I want people to be able to do in the world. And having them in a room and able to really focus on human interaction and human experience in this very close way is like something I really believe in. And that's basically why I do study and teach literature, because I think it helps us to avoid these kind of generalizations and, you know, broad kind of ways of thinking about politics or history that don't really capture, I think, the complexity of the situation. And I'll just say for a second that, um, you know, I think this book makes the case very much in terms um, of attention to feeling and looking very carefully at these how feelings are processed, how they're experienced, how they're represented. Um, but actually, in my next book called Underdogs is actually it's really not even about literature; it's about social sciences. But it's basically making an argument on behalf of description, attention, and observation as important arts and sciences, um, kind of across academic fields, and really as just a sort of life praxis. So, just your comment makes me think that that is something that has been very consistent across my career on different topics, right? That I think that paying careful attention, and actually trying to represent and communicate the mixed experiences and complex realities that are out there, is so important. And I think that's important when times are good and when times are bad, right? And so absolutely, I just want to amplify what you said about, we're not living in utopian times, definitely not. But we're not living in the apocalypse either, right? And that I think both that utopian kind of thought and apocalyptic thought tend to lead to political passivity and just there's nothing left, there's nothing we can do, right? I'm sorry, I know you have to translate all of this and it's a lot. But if I could just say one more thing, I mean, I think in the realm of climate change, right? One strategy for making people care about climate change was to say, the catastrophe is happening, right? And I think that from what I hear about climate scientists and climate activists today, they say, well, we've passed that point where things can really be improved, but every half degree matters. Every incremental change matters. So we can't give up. We can't just say, yes, it's over, it's done with, because actually it will change our reality in so many ways, just the changes that we can make. And so I think paying attention to the details and the specific reality that we face, whether it's really dark as it is now politically and in terms of climate, or whether things are more positive, I think it's absolutely important to keeping political will.
Bien. Agradece mucho que hayamos estado toda la tarde hablando de tu libro, que agradece la lectura, el comentario de Marte, que te parece que evita una lectura equivocada del libro, como si hubiera querido decir que no todo mejora sino que todo empeora, cuando justamente te da no tener que elegir entre el orgullo y la vergüenza, que no hay que elegir entre el orgullo y la vergüenza, entre la historia progresiva y la regresiva, sino un argumento sobre cuando se achica el alcance de lo posible y de la atención que se le presta a las experiencias de la gente. Había algo que me pareció que le parecía una humanista, y que prestar la atención a las experiencias, a los sentimientos, lleva a entender la situación social, no que sean irrelevantes o una parte pequeña de la política, sino que usamos y prestamos atención a los sentimientos como indicadores importantes. Está pasando, pero que sí requiere eso, no pensar en blanco y negro, en como opciones alternativas, either or, sino cultivar prácticas de atención cuidadosa a lo que vive y siente la gente. Cree que eso es en general el motivo por el cual se estudia y enseña literatura, un lugar para enseñar a prestar atención a los puntos finos de la experiencia, y que esta capacidad de prestar atención quiere que la tenga la gente en el mundo, la posibilidad de enfocarse en las interacciones, en las experiencias humanas, creo que es una condición para ella. La literatura ayuda a evitar generalizaciones y modos amplios y generalizantes de pensar la política, la historia, que no llegan a capturar también la complejidad de las situaciones. El argumento del libro tenía que ver con esta atención a los sentimientos, una mirada cuidadosa sobre cómo se procesan, se viven y se representan los sentimientos, y que, bueno, eso pasa en Sentirse para atrás, pero que en el libro que está trabajando ahora, trabajando los dos, que vamos a estar ahí, está publicado. Bueno, pero en el no, así que no tengo la atención de una que no son literatura, sino sobre ciencias sociales. El argumento igual sigue siendo por la descripción, la atención, la observación como una parte importante, en este caso de la ciencia en general, a través de las disciplinas, como una praxis vital. Entonces, su comentario de Mario le hizo darse cuenta de, o llegar a la conciencia de la consistencia de su carrera sobre prestar atención, tratar de representar y comunicar las experiencias y las realidades complejas es importante, tanto cuando los tiempos son buenos como cuando son malos. Entonces, bueno, no vivimos, retomar el comentario de Mario, que no vivimos ni en una utopía ni en una apocalipsis, y que ambos modos de pensar, el utópico y el apocalíptico, llevan a la posibilidad política, a la idea de que no hay nada que hacer. Y entonces, con el cambio climático, una estrategia del activismo puede decir que la catástrofe está por ocurrir, está ocurriendo, pero que desde la ciencia, desde el activismo climático, hoy ya pasó ese momento donde podíamos hacer un cambio de estar la catástrofe, pero que todo cambio importa, que no nos podemos rendir, que cada medio grado cambiará de muchas maneras la realidad en la que viviremos, esta atención a los detalles, incluso una realidad muy oscura, es importante para la voluntad política. I'm a translator, but I don't usually interpret these lives or.
To tell us a little bit more about your ongoing project. Thoughts and reflections.
She asked if you could maybe tell us some more about your current projects.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry, for people who are speaking back in the room, the sound quality is not good, but I can hear it when you say it. So, yes, so well, I mentioned Underdog, so that came out a couple of years ago. That's kind of taken me into this whole other world about social science. But actually, I'm doing a book now that's called To Be Real, which is the name of a disco song. And it's about the ways that people in working in sort of canonical queer theory. So, 1990s, 1980s and 1990s, the people who first sort of made queer criticism happen, used personal anecdotes and slang and talked about having sex and told jokes and basically innovated or transformed academic criticism. So this is like a really striking thing to read this work. I mean, there was a history of feminist criticism that I think had incorporated some kind of personal experience, but it's almost across the board, everyone working in this field of queer criticism broke the rules of academic behavior. They didn't act like professors. And honestly, I don't think that I probably would have become a professor if it weren't for that change, because it felt like what you could do and how you could write was so different. So I'm writing a book about some of my favorite essays and books from that time. These are, I think, probably, someone like Eve Sedgwick. People know that, she was a poet and she wrote a book about her psychoanalytic treatment, and wrote about her own breast cancer. She wrote a lot about herself, but also many other critics at that time have got an essay on this amazing, amazing piece by Susan Stryker, who basically founded the field of trans studies. Um, I highly recommend that essay, which I think has been translated, but it's called My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, Performing Transgender Rage. That's to say, it's an essay in the voice of Frankenstein's monster. So Susan Stryker is writing from the position of Frankenstein's monster, saying, as a trans person, I was also made by a doctor. I also got came to life on a surgical table. And she's sort of talking about that. So very personal, very striking. Her name is Susan Stryker. It's very striking. But anyway, so I'm working on a book about these essays and basically trying to understand how this field, which was so much questioning the idea of the person or the subject, this is very psychoanalytic, it's very post-structuralist, sort of Judith Butler citing Friedrich Nietzsche, saying, there is no subject behind the behavior, right? There is no person there. And that was kind of a shared belief among these critics that, you know, they were against identity, they were against the kind of expressive subject, the person, but they also then wrote about their own personal experience. So I'm kind of thinking about the paradox of critics, and I think this is more broadly true of kind of post-structuralist critics who don't believe in the person and yet talk about themselves. So, you know, it's a kind of, I think people sort of see the paradox there, but I don't think anyone has really focused on it as a book. And I admire that writing so much. So I'm trying to write kind of more like essays, a bit personal in a way. I'm writing about my teacher in college, Barbara Johnson, who wasn't really a queer critic, but did sort of come out. But she's also a deconstructionist, a student of Paul de Man, and so on. So I'm trying to also kind of write in that tradition in some way, and to take on yeah, and just to celebrate some of that writing, which I find so amazing.
Bueno, la pregunta además fue por contarnos sobre sus proyectos. Y bueno, ando dos secretarios de un par de años, y ahora está escribiendo un libro que se llama To Be Real, que es una canción disco, y que trata principalmente sobre la crítica, la teoría queer más canónica de los 90s, cómo abordaban estos críticos hablando anécdotas personales, slang, sexo, chistes, que fue toda una innovación para la crítica académica en general, y me pareció muy impresionante. Entonces, dice, en la historia de la crítica feminista ya había incorporado la experiencia personal, pero esta crítica queer rompió las reglas a todos. De forma general rompían todas las reglas, no actuaban como profesores, ella no se hubiera convertido en profesora si no hubiera sido por la formación. Entonces está haciendo un libro sobre sus ensayos preferidos de esa época. Menciona a Sedgwick, que bueno, todo el mundo, mucha gente sabe, que es la poeta, que escribió sobre sus tratamientos psicoanalíticos, sobre su cáncer de mama, sobre sí misma, pero que también había muchos otros. Mencionaba el ensayo de Stryker, que está conocido.
El monstruo hablar.
Bueno, Monstruos hablar, que lo recomiendo mucho, que escribe, que habla desde la voz de Frankenstein, desde la voz del monstruo, y desde esa posición, dice, como persona trans, a mí me hizo un médico, yo nací en una mesa de cirugía, entonces me parece muy impresionante, muy personal, y también chiste con que striking, impresionante, la cuestión de Striker. Tratar, entonces, bueno, tratar de entender la letra, esta idea de el cuestionamiento del pensamiento del sujeto, de la persona y el sujeto, y que era muy psicoanalítico, muy postestructuralista, las citas de Butler, citando a Nietzsche, no hay sujeto detrás de comportamiento, no hay persona detrás de eso. Entonces, esa era una creencia compartida entre estos críticos, ir en contra de la identidad, pero también escribían sobre sus experiencias personales. Entonces, esta paradoja o esta contradicción, que es más amplia en general para la crítica postestructuralista, de no creer en la persona, pero hablar todo el tiempo de sí mismo. Entonces, esta contradicción que me parece que no fue abordada enfocadamente en un libro escribiendo sobre eso, y también sobre cómo admira esa escritura que está tratando de escribir un poco en esa tradición, más ensayísticamente, más personal, sobre su profesor en el general facultad, que era muy perfeccionista, que trabajaba por demanda, y que está escribiendo en esa tradición y celebrando esa tradición.
Muchas gracias.
Algo sobre el campo literario. ¿Cuál afectó la publicación de su libro? Específicamente los estudios sobre literatura. Para eso tiene eso.
So, I think we have time for one last question, and we hear Nicolas ask if you could tell us how the publishing of your book impacted in the field of literary studies. So.
like how my book affected literary studies? Is that the question, or?
Yes.
La perspectiva queer de esos estudios.
And queer approaches to literary studies.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to talk about it myself, maybe like, oh, it's just very influential, it's so important. But it's true that I mean, I think the book has had a couple different kinds of reception, or maybe a few, because like I said, there is this, I think, a kind of personal reception, which, you know, and I don't expect people to who really get the sort of psychological benefit of the book to maybe read the chapter on Walter Pater. I mean, it's very much, you know, academic and so on. So, you know, I think people sort of get the idea of feeling backward and the sort of sympathy toward that experience. That's one reception. And I also think it's had a kind of impact in just the general field of queer studies. It was part of a moment when there was a lot of interest in affect. I mean, Sedgwick's work is important, but also lots of people, and questions of good feeling and bad feeling were very present. So I think it became part of that field, and I've you know, I think there's now like a kind of the queer study of emotion, I would say, is a field that, you know, many other people have participated in, but I was happy to be part of that, the growth of that field. But I'm also very aware as a literary scholar of the work that really does work with literature and with language and with text, and also deals with questions of representation, of aesthetics, and of literature, the history of literature. So that's what I do. That's what my students do. I teach in the English department at Penn. You know, my colleagues are working on medieval literature and Shakespeare and all kinds of things, right? Like I'm an English professor and I work on the history of literature. But, you know, when there is, for instance, right now I'm writing an afterword to a new collection about, it's about transgender representation and literary modernism, right? So, and you know, I think that when these young scholars want to write a book about the representation of trans experience and trans life in literature specifically, there's not like a huge number of people that they say, oh, this person can talk about trans life and they can talk about literary history. So, you know, I think that's an important field, an important conjunction, and I work on that, and I try to train my own graduate students to do that kind of work, which I think, you know, I think it's really important. And just because, you know, everything I was saying about literature and what a good kind of what a good laboratory it is for thinking about carefully about emotion and human interaction and human experience. I mean, that also is true about literature and sexuality, desire, stigma, all of the things I care about, power, they're all in literature. And I think literature is a good way to get at the specific details of that. So I'm not exactly sure if that's what you were asking, but those are some thoughts about the field and why I think it's important.
Bueno, la pregunta fue sobre cómo impactó el estilo de los estudios literarios y estoy diciendo que es un poco raro hablar de cómo el impacto que tuvo uno en un campo, es decir, raro lo que dice el muy incluyente, qué raro. Pero igual, pues, Porque sí creo que el libro tuvo varias recepciones. Primero volvió la recepción personal que ya mencionó, para quienes encuentran un beneficio psicológico en este libro, ya no esperaba que llegara el capítulo sobre Peter, que era un poco académico, que la gente junta recibir esta idea de sentirse para atrás y cierta empatía o simpatía con eso. Después, un impacto, una reflexión en el campo de los estudios queer, en un momento que tenía mucho interés en el afecto, en las preguntas sobre los sentimientos buenos y malos, eran preguntas muy presentes, y que, bueno, fue parte de ese campo. Que hoy existe este campo del estudio de las emociones, y está feliz de haber contribuido al crecimiento de ese campo. Y también es inconsciente en cuanto académica de la literatura, que sobre el trabajo sobre la literatura, el lenguaje y el texto, y también sobre las representaciones estéticas y la historia de la literatura, se dedica a eso, tenía un departamento de literatura con colegas de literatura medieval que se dedican a Shakespeare. Comentó que ahora estaba haciendo un posfacio de una compilación sobre representaciones trans y modernismo literario, y que para los investigadores jóvenes que quieren escribir sobre la representación de vida trans, en literatura específicamente no hay tanta gente que pueda hablar de los dos campos a la vez. Eso me parece que es una inclusión muy importante, es un trabajo en eso, que dedica formas para eso, y me parece muy importante también por lo que dijo antes de la literatura como un buen laboratorio para las emociones, las interacciones, las experiencias humanas, que eso también vale para la literatura y la sexualidad, para el deseo, el estigma, el poder, como todas las cosas que me interesan, que están todos en la literatura, y que es un buen modo de crear los detalles y poder decir. Thank you so much. ¿Algo más? We love you so much.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for reading my work. And I'm just so grateful that you guys are spending the time thinking about this material. And also, just to say, like, if anybody ever wants to write to me, or my email is just on the Penn website. Like, you guys, I'm available. I'm here, and I would love to be in conversation in going forward, and I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. All right. Have a good night.
Thank you.